On this week's episode, we dive into a YouTube rabbit hole and die of rubella. Also, we're discussing some pretty heavy topics this week, including death, sexual assault, mass shootings, and things of that nature. Listener discretion is advised. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Anxietymonkies podcast. I'm your host, Rob, and joining me here in the studio is my co-host, Michelle.
Good morning, everyone. And just a heads up, we have snow outside.
Yep, we didn't get a white Christmas, but we're starting the new year off with a couple of inches of snow here just outside of Chicago. So for our first episode of the new year, we're going to start by taking a look at incels.
Hey, Rob, what exactly is an incel?
Okay, so incel stands for involuntarily celibate. The basic idea is that these are people who want a sexual relationship with a person and they feel like they aren't capable of having a sexual relationship. And typically there's some blame associated with that. They blame society. They blame themselves.
They also blame other people as well.
Absolutely, yes. Now, the thing about incels is that the movement originally was started by a woman who set up a message board where people could talk about their problems in interacting with sexual partners of their choosing. But that movement was quickly hijacked by men, and it has since become kind of a cesspit of toxic masculinity. And it's not just an American phenomenon. You see some of the same trends in places like Japan, for instance, or in Western Europe, which kind of points to underlying societal causes that may be common to all of these places, rather than it just being an American problem. The thing is that it didn't take long for the incel movement and the idea to take a dark turn. Modern-day incels typically are men. There are female incels out there, but they're typically shouted down. And amongst the incel community themselves, the incels act as though it's impossible for female incels to exist because in their eyes, women are capable of having all of the sex that they want, and thus it's impossible for them to truly be incels.
Boy, sex all the time. I love it.
Right? So among some of the ideas that they have, are the ideas that everybody who isn't an incel is either a Chad or a Stacy. Chads are hyper-masculine, attractive in all the conventional ways, maybe financially well-to-do, like they've got their stuff together. And that Stacys are, these glamorous women who are only sexually attracted to Chads, and that an incel, can't have a Stacy.
Now, I'm surprised they didn't do Barbie and Ken
instead
of Chad and Stacy.
Yeah, but I think part of the thing there is that Barbie and Ken aren't anatomically correct.
And then also, you could always done Brad and Janet,
which would be a Rocky Horror deep cut, for those of you out there who are into that sort of thing. But here's the thing, incels don't just want a girlfriend. They feel like they're owed a girlfriend, and that the girlfriend pretty much has to be perfect. She's got to be virginal, beautiful, submissive, all of those 1950s tropes about what an ideal woman should be. And it's not just enough for them to be all of that. They also must be monogamous. And there's people like Benzo spokesperson Jordan Peterson feeding into that with calls for forced monogamy, which is a weird flex for somebody, who's such a darling of the libertarian set. Where does free will factor in if you're forced into a relationship?
And of course, if you're expecting somebody to be kinky in bed and everything else, but yet virginal, how in the world are you going to get that experience?
Excellent question. But I don't think critical thinking is really a part of their skill set. So anyway, they seem to fall into kind of two camps. One camp is nice guys. They basically view women as vending machines. They see relationships as being almost purely transactional. These are the kind of guys who spend money, who do favors for women, thinking that if I put enough good deeds in, then sex somehow falls out.
Now, this reminds me of an ex-boyfriend I had who always felt that if he did me a favor, in turn, I owed him sex.
Yeah, it's kind of gross. I don't really know what to say about that other than it's disgusting. It's not a good look. It's definitely not healthy.
And that, it was basically like viewed if I didn't fulfill this exchangement that I was wrong.
Like you let him down somehow?
Yes.
Yeah, I've known a few people like this in real life as well. Their aesthetic seems to revolve around whining, like around the women that are the targets of their quote-unquote affections. They would never mention this stuff, but behind the scenes when they're talking, I think the phrase locker room talk has been thrown around a few times, when it's just the boys, kind of on our own talking and doing our own thing. They whine incessantly. Even we can't stand to be around them. But I don't think we have it nearly as bad as the women in their lives. The other camp are these so-called pickup artist types. They seem to think that they all have these theories about how to trick women into giving them what they want. Again, it's not built on consent or respect or anything like that. Some of these guys are borderline rapists in how they talk about women. I don't know how much. Again, it's kind of that locker room talk sort of thing where, you get a bunch of guys together, we start talking about things, and some of what you're hearing is out and out bullshit. These guys seem to think that neurolinguistic programming is a thing, that hypnosis is a thing that they can use to coerce women. And again, no consent, no respect, no building a healthy relationship. It's all about seeing women as objects that need to perform in the manner that they want them to perform in. One of the other things that both of these groups have in common is they like to throw the word friend-zoned around a lot. Again, this reflects on their ideas and their views towards women, where if the woman's not performing in the way that they want, they've been banished to this friend zone where they're never going to get sex from her.
Now, I've heard this term a lot in high school.
Yeah, same here. And that was, in my case, well over 20 years ago. It's not a new phenomenon. Mm-hmm. I think what's going on there is that it's just gained almost kind of like a meme value. It's one of those things that found its way onto the internet and enough people went, oh yeah, this applies to me. I'm friend zoned. That it's gained its own momentum. But here's the thing is that it would be one thing if all they did was talk. These assholes have real-world implications, unfortunately. There have been something like 6 or 7 mass shooting events that have resulted in something like 53 deaths. And these have been people who, identify as incels or have included incel-related themes in their manifestos that they've left behind. I'm not going to be naming these individuals. That's an editorial choice on our part, not to give these dorks any publicity. But there is a Mother Jones article out there that also, looks at the trend of mass shootings and toxic masculinity if you want more information. That one does include names, and the manifestos themselves are out there. But again, I'm not going to be giving them any airtime. So the question is the incel community a symptom of a sick society? Back in the day, as I mentioned, I knew a few of these nice guy types, and it seemed like they were mostly content to confine their whining and bitching to just us guys. Again, that locker room talk sort of thing. They mostly kind of threw a blanket over it and appeared to behave themselves in public, if you will. They've gotten some traction thanks in part to the internet, but I don't want to throw the internet under the bus here because the same things that have made the incels such a thing to be reckoned with in this day and age have also been beneficial to communities like the atheist community or the LGBTQ community, where, you might not have other people to commiserate with in your small town, or you might not have people like you in your own social circle. So the internet can be a good influence for people in those communities where they can find other voices and gain the strength to, either come out themselves and be that voice in their community, or, at least take knowledge in the fact that, hey, I'm not alone. There's other people like me out there.
And I agree with you that I don't think it's fair to necessarily throw the internet under the bus at this time in connection to this, because of the fact I'm sure it was going on way before the internet even was thought of.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
And so tying the internet to this is just astronomical, and it's way out there.
I don't think it's unfair to look at the internet and say that the internet plays a role in this, but the internet's like a tool. the same hammer that I use to nail a couple of 2x4s together is also the same hammer that I smashed my frickin' thumb with. It's how you use it. I think the underlying issues are societal ones. In Fahrenheit 9/11, for instance, Michael Moore took kind of a look at that when he was talking about the Columbine shootings and how the shooters, had a life where they had very little parental supervision or interaction, and they had what may be considered legitimate societal grievances.
Now, I don't know if you can actually say society is to blame as well, because these actions that these people are taking, they're acting like Joffrey in comparison, in that, somebody has turned them down and they're not exercising their jealousy or anger or misplacement in a healthy way. And so they're taking it out on every single woman out there or every single man out there.
Yeah, you're not wrong. I don't think it's society as a whole. I think some of it is with the individual themselves, where they kind of lash out at everybody and they view their grievances through a very specific lens. But I think there are underlying societal conditions that contribute to the problem. There's a lot of people who, because of the way their work is, who feel isolated. One example that comes to mind is the dilemma of the retail worker. This is somebody who's subject to the whims of the schedule typically developed by, some sort of software program. So they don't really have fixed time off, time to socialize, or, who can bank on the idea that their companies are so understaffed that even on their days off, they might be called to drop everything and come on in. Kind of hard to have a social life when you don't have the ability to schedule your free time. So things like that, I think, these are some of the underlying symptoms that contribute to the problem. Another one being, it's kind of hard to have a social life when your income is just barely adequate to maybe meet your basic needs if you're lucky, So you end up spending more of your free time scrambling, doing side hustles or whatever, just trying to keep yourself afloat. But this isn't my area of expertise, and I'd be the first to admit that I don't know what the solution is. But when I look out there and see what's going on, I definitely see some problems.
Before we go any further, I feel that I need to say that we are not psychologists. And please don't panic if you know somebody that fits some of what we've brought up.
Yeah, in short, don't take medical advice from a podcast, folks. We're not psychologists, we're not sociologists, we're just a couple of folks in Illinois. And on that cheerful note, I think it's time for an ad break. Today's episode is brought to you by Pages Printed Plastics. You can visit us at pagesprintedplastics.com. That's PAIGES printedplastics.com. We have a couple of different printers. We can do design as well as print. We can print anything from small figures like D&D miniatures to larger objects like computer parts, toys, props, pretty much anything you can imagine. So feel free to check us out. Again, that's pagesprintedplastics.com. And we're back. Before we continue, I want to offer a quick correction. It wasn't Fahrenheit 9/11 where Michael Moore looked at the Columbine shooting. That was the movie Bowling for Columbine. My apologies. Anyway, moving on. So next we're going to take a look at the anti-vax movement. We've had vaccinations here in the West since the 1700s, but a process called variolation predates that and was done in India and China long before we started doing it. It didn't really gain official recognition until a white guy adapted the process to handle smallpox. But we're not going to go into a history of vaccination. If you want that, there's a podcast called This Podcast Will Kill You that's done a couple of episodes on the topic. There's plenty of other information out there. But here in the West, vaccine reluctance, fear, distrust pretty much existed right from the get-go. There are political cartoons that exist from that time period that show people freaking out about the idea of being vaccinated for smallpox. And there's other factors that play into it. Religion, alternative medicine, things like chiropractic and homeopathy drive vaccine reluctance. There's data from all over the world that shows an increase in illnesses in places where vaccine reluctance reaches a tipping point. In particular, I'm thinking about places like Pakistan, where groups like the Taliban spread some really nasty rumors about the purposes of things like the polio vaccine vaccine as being a means to sterilize the population and keep them from breeding. When you see that kind of traction gain foothold, people stop taking the vaccines. And hey, what do you know? The disease that they're trying to eradicate gains momentum. But I'd be the first to admit that we're an American-centric podcast. We're based here in the U.S., so we tend to focus on issues right here in our backyard, as it were. And if you want to look at the anti-vax movement here in the United States, you actually have to start in Great Britain. In 1998, a doctor named Andrew Wakefield published a paper in The Lancet that claimed to prove a link between the MMR vaccine and autism. Now, this was a study based on 12 children, and there were other irregularities in his work, such as soliciting blood samples from children at birthday parties and things like that. Peer review didn't agree with the claims, and Wakefield also had a conflict of interest in that the study was financed by a group of attorneys who were looking to sue the manufacturers of MMR vaccines. The paper was subsequently pulled from The Lancet, and when he was investigated, in 2010, the UK revoked his medical license. But this didn't stop him from continuing the grift. As recently as 2016, he was involved in the production of a quote-unquote documentary called Vaxxed, which you can still find pretty much anywhere you want on the internet. I'm not going to recommend it. I'd rather scrape my eyeballs with a cheese grater than watch it. But hey, you do you. But since then, the real face of the anti-vax movement here in the United States has become Jenny McCarthy. She was a model and an actor, and I think her most prominent roles were appearing in Playboy magazine and on a MTV game show called Singled Out. She promotes chelation therapy and vitamin treatments, which she claims cured her child of autism. Now, there are some real questions about whether or not her child actually had autism in the first place, or if he was misdiagnosed, and I'm not going to get into that. But the laundry list of treatments that she applied to her kid is basically a laundry list of woo. In addition to conventional intensive applied behavioral analysis therapy, McCarthy prescribed her son to a gluten-free and casein-free diet, hyperbaric oxygen chambers, chelation, aromatherapy, electromagnetics, spoons rubbed on his body, multivitamin therapy, B12 shots, and numerous prescription drugs. And since then, she's gone on, to appear on TV, in magazine interviews, to promote anti-vaccination. Now, they've lost some traction in the years since Andrew Wakefield published his bogus paper in The Lancet. These days, they would consider themselves vaccine reluctant as opposed to anti-vax, and they push for delaying the doctor-recommended vaccine schedule. Instead of getting the shots on the schedule that doctors recommend, they want to spread it out. Now, let me be clear. I have no sympathy for these assholes. I do have sympathy for people who can't get vaccinated because they have reactions to the shots or they're immune compromised or what have you. And it's these people that we're trying to protect by vaccinating the rest of us. I see vaccination as something like a civic duty. Those of us who can get the shots have a responsibility to get them in order to help establish herd immunity and protect the people who can't get the shots.
And also, I feel like this sort of borders like child neglect or child endangerment if you neglect to get them at all for your children because of the fact you're putting your children at risk.
Yeah, you're not just putting your kids at risk, you're putting other people's kids at risk as well. And frankly, I don't think that a variety of the exceptions that exist should exist. I think the only valid exceptions are medical based. I think things like religious exemptions and personal conscience objections in this case are bullshit and need to be eliminated, period. And the data backs me up on this. Things like whooping cough and measles are both on the rise in the US. These are diseases that had become rare. You almost never see them. And now there have been outbreaks in places like Disneyland because people don't vaccinate their children. There is some good news, though. With the COVID-19 outbreak, it does seem like people are becoming possibly more accepting of the vaccine. Not at the rates that I would like, but there is some progress. But even then, this isn't purely good news. There's a case of an individual in Wisconsin who felt compelled to take 500 doses of the COVID-19 vaccine out of the freezers they were being stored in to destroy them. And it appears that his thinking was that people would then get vaccines that have absolutely no effect. At this time, we still don't know his deeper motives. We don't know what his thinking was. But there are still people who have a very negative opinion, not based in science, about the efficacy of vaccines and whether or not they're going to get them. And the thing that scares me is how many of these people are in the health profession itself, because these Right now, we're targeting the COVID-19 vaccine to our first responders, to medical workers. Operation Derp Speed is all about getting those people squared away first so that they can go out and continue to work with the public, work with the sick, and eventually we'll roll out the vaccine to everybody else. There's also kind of a political element to the anti-vax movement that I kind of want to touch on here. Up until fairly recently, anti-vax or vaccine reluctance had mostly been a political issue on the left side of the political spectrum. Your typical anti-vaxxer was a liberal-leaning woman with a college education. These days, though, that script seems to have been flipped. I'm certain they're still out there, but now it's jumped the divide, and vaccine reluctance, at least as far as COVID-19 is concerned, seems to be a darling of the political right, which I find weird as hell considering that Operation Derp Speed was Donald Trump's endorsed project. You'd think that these people would be all on board with it, but instead, there's this sort of Venn diagram where the QAnon movement, which I'm not going to get into here because that's its own thing, has really turned on the idea of vaccines, and they spout these weird conspiracy theories where Bill Gates wants to microchip all of us with the vaccine and use 5G cell towers to activate it to track us or some damn thing. It doesn't make a whole hell of a lot of sense. But then again, sense and the QAnon movement are roughly 5 miles apart.
Now, if you want to look at these things because you're curious, by all means go ahead, but please take it with a grain of salt and just be aware that what you're looking at is just really all
It's a rabbit hole.
It's conspiracy theories and just a bunch of random garbage.
Yeah, the rabbit hole is deep on this one. If you want more information on it, I'd recommend a podcast called QAnon Anonymous. But keep in mind, they've done something like hundreds of episodes digging into this, so it really is kind of how deep do you want to go with this? How far down the rabbit hole? So kind of tying these two things together, we talked earlier about the internet and its role in the incel movement, but we only really just scratched the surface. There's kind of a history here. The incel movement, for instance, basically traces its roots back to 4chan. Now, 4chan was kind of an American offshoot of something called 2chan, which was a Japanese board dedicated to anime and manga. A guy named Christopher Poole, who goes by the name of Moot, set up one, for a more English-centric audience. And they've been a problem for several reasons. I mean, there have been numerous cases where the FBI has stepped in because people have posted child pornography on 4chan. There have been mass shootings where people, will make a statement like, hey, watch the news for a certain place tomorrow, and then they go out and commit a mass shooting. And it looked like we were going to get some progress on this past summer when Cloudflare announced that they were taking away DNS resolution for 4chan. Now, DNS resolution is where you type in a web address, www.something.com, and the DNS resolution takes that, converts it to the actual IP address and sends you where you're trying to go. So Cloudflare took that away. I think they also took away distributed denial of service attack protection. And those two things should have spelled the death of 4chan, but like a cockroach, man, you hit them with a shoe and they somehow survived. So 4chan really hasn't done anything to address the incel issue. There have been other internet sites that have addressed the issue. Reddit and YouTube have both issued bans. Facebook has issued bans on a case-by-case basis, but in all of these cases, it's too little too late, in my opinion. Same thing for the anti-vax movement. Facebook has eliminated a bunch of Facebook groups that are dedicated to being anti-vax, but the response has been that people set up secret Facebook groups where the general public can't see what's going on. These have been infiltrated by individuals who then turn around and report them to Facebook, and Facebook eliminates them, but it's a game of whack-a-mole.
And it's just, they should have taken action sooner than what they did. And it's just like, closing the barn doors after the horses have gotten out.
Yeah, absolutely. And it kind of points to what their motives really are. Facebook, Reddit, YouTube, all of these sites don't do these bans because they're the right thing to do. They do these bans because it impacts potential advertising. So it's not them behaving in any sort of way that's geared towards the public good. And again, I don't know what the solution here is. I don't necessarily trust the government to tell these websites how to conduct their affairs. because there's a definite slippery slope argument to be made. And with the nature of our government these days, it's not such a far stretch, in my opinion. I could totally see them getting pissed off about not just, pornography and things like that, but also getting pissed off because religion doesn't play as prominent a role as they think it should, or because of the perception of banning conservative thought. One of the things that Facebook seems to keep running into is, hey, whenever we try to ban Nazi-adjacent speech, it also wants to take out, these algorithms that they develop also want to take out conservative Facebook pages. Now, I would look at that and say, well, gee, there's a common link. No wonder your algorithm's targeting both. But it doesn't stop people like Steve King from throwing hissy fits in congressional hearings about this sort of thing.
And even if the government did step in and try to do something about it, what's to prevent them from circumventing that and just doing their own thing anyway?
Right, like one of the things I've wondered about in cases where the U.S. government has stepped in and said, you can't run these certain pages here in the U.S., like Backpage, for instance, got wiped out thanks to Sesta Fosta. What's to stop people from setting up websites in foreign countries, and having like a .ru domain instead of a .com domain in order to carry out the business that they want to carry out? I know in some cases that has resulted in arrests. I'm thinking of the New Zealand guy behind mega.com, where the government came after him for hosting copyrighted material and other violations. He was set up in a foreign country, but the minute he stepped foot on U.S. soil, they went ahead and arrested him. I think it was at an airport. So, yeah, you raise a valid point. There are circumventions that are possible even if the government were to step in. But again, though, I don't necessarily think it's the place of the government. But again, I also don't know what the solution is. And on that cheerful note, folks, that's going to do it for us this week. You can find us on most of the major podcast markets, and if you review us and give us a 5-star rating, that would help other people find us. We're on Twitter at Anxietymonkies, Facebook at facebook.com/anxietymonkies, and you can email us at anxietymonkies@gmail.com. In addition, we have a Twitch channel that's twitch.tv/anxietymonkies, and tomorrow I will be playing Pugsley's Scavenger Hunt for the NES. And finally, if you've got a couple of bucks you want to throw our way, you can do that at patreon.com/anxietymonkeys, or go in for a one-time donation at paypal.me/anxietymonkeys.
And if you have friends that haven't found us yet, don't be afraid to share us.
Absolutely. Until next week, she's Michelle, I'm Rob, and we're your Anxiety Monkeys.